work in some states, depending on their laws, is really still going to be underway. There will still be counting going on in some states, and that's not a bad thing, by the way. That's those states complying with their law. So the countdown really isn't to Election Day, as we've come to learn since 2020. It's a few days afterwards, and sometimes even beyond. Arguably, maybe even the Electoral College on December 17th really is the end game here. So we're wiser than we were even 4 years ago.
Can you also put in context for viewers that if it's taking a while, maybe in certain states, it does not necessarily mean that something nefarious is going on. It is a reflection in some states of the way that it's meant to work, whether that's frustrating, whether it means a long time, whether it's different than the state maybe you grew up in. But explain how it doesn't mean something bad is going on. It just might be what happens because this is really close.
Yes, amen to that. So in Minnesota, for example, our law is, and many other states have this law, that the ballots have to be in by today, including all mail ballots. And so that means by breakfast tomorrow morning, we're going to know substantially all the results. But other states have other laws. Pennsylvania, for example, is a state where they can't start counting all the mail ballots that come in until after the polls close tonight. So of course they will be counting into tomorrow and perhaps the next day and the next day. Then there are states of varying political complexions, from California to Mississippi, that have a postmark rule, for example, where as long as you get that ballot in the mail by Election Day, it can come days later and still be counted. So the fact that counting will still be going on later this week is not a sign that anyone did anything wrong, that there's any sort of misbehavior going on. It's those states following their laws. They're doing the right thing. So I just want Americans to understand and not to jump to maybe unwarranted conclusions about what's going on if we don't have full and complete results by tonight.
I also want to ask about, for viewers who are concerned or maybe confused about the partisan aspect or maybe lack thereof in a role like yours in the Secretary of State. I mentioned you're a Democrat. For example, your governor, Tim Walz, on the ballot for vice president. He's a Democrat. I'm sure you've worked together closely over the years, governor and Secretary of State. But walk us through what being a Democrat, or if you were a Republican in a different state as Secretary of State, has to do or has nothing to do with how you run an election, what happens on Election Day. And maybe if you wouldn't mind kind of separating out in this example, you know, how you might feel about your friend or wanting them to win or how you'd vote, but then do your job fairly even with him on the ballot.
Yeah, I think all secretaries of state, regardless of party, are united on one strong principle. Though we may run for office with a party label, you have to leave your politics at the door. You have to. And I've seen my colleagues across the country, regardless of orientation politically, absolutely adhere to that value. And that means you do not put your thumb on the scale for your or any other political party or favored candidate or cause or anything of the kind. And the good news there as well is that in almost every state, it's a very decentralized system. It's not a top-down system. It's a system where the counting of the votes, for example, goes on in thousands and thousands of places across a given state. It's your friends and neighbors doing the counting. It's not the Secretary of State or that person's office. So I think structurally we're set up to get the politics out of it in almost every instance. And I know my colleagues of both sides of the aisle. They are conscientious people. They're trying to do the right thing by all of their citizens, and they do a really good job of separating their own personal politics from the business of overseeing their election systems.
Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon, obviously it is a busy day for you. We very much appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, the final NBC polling of the 2024 presidential campaign shows the race is still neck and neck. And this morning, concern is growing about whether the results will be challenged, as they were and as we remember in 2020. All this comes as the former president is once again making false claims about the election. NBC News senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett has more on the potential legal challenges that lie ahead.
Hey there, good morning. The legal landscape heading into this day is different than 2020. There are new guardrails, more vigilant from state officials, and more early decisions already we've seen from the courts. But the language that's been used by the former president could foreshadow the battles ahead.
Last time it started months before the election.
It's a disaster, so that's something you have to think about. We don't want to have a rigged election. When you see ballots with the name Trump, military ballots from our great military, and they're dumped in garbage cans.
That is a handful. We could go all night, which we won't.
No,
but we
it's
could go all
happening
night,
every day.
one by one, a single case, a single day. You're talking about 150 million votes. Your own FBI director says there is no evidence of widespread
really?
fraud.
Well, then he's not doing a very good job.
Now, former President Donald Trump is again raising baseless accusations.
They cheat. That's the only way we're going to lose.
The only thing can stop us is the cheating. It's the only thing that can stop us.
Laying the groundwork for another Trump campaign to potentially claim the election was stolen if he loses. Though he didn't win in 2020, the race was so tight it took days to make the final call.
This is a fraud on the American public.
The high number of mail-in ballots creating a unique challenge.
It takes time to count millions of votes.
Pennsylvania's top election official Al Schmidt says he expects more than 30% of voters cast their ballots by mail this election. But state law prevents officials from beginning to process those ballots until today. One part of what creates an unknown gap in the time between when polls close tonight and when a winner is called.
We've seen that as a real period of vulnerability for people to try to undermine confidence in the results.
In 2020, Mr. Trump seized on that period of uncertainty. He and his allies attempting to pressure top officials in swing states to reverse the results.
I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
Later organizing phony slates of pro-Trump presidential electors.
Thank you for voting.
But top officials in key battleground states are on guard this time, vowing to sue local officials if they try to delay certifying the vote.
The election officials are prepared for a lot of bad things this time that didn't materialize in 2020 that were threatened.
Plus, election law experts point to recent changes to the federal law governing the Electoral College.
It removed ambiguity from the previous system.
Still, the battleground states have been inundated with an avalanche of nearly 200 lawsuits already. Some states facing allegations of voting by non-citizens, which research shows is exceedingly rare. But Mr. Trump has pushed the claims on social media.
Now, many of the lawsuits filed already could easily come back to life in the weeks ahead. Others appear more geared towards political messaging for now. And then, of course, there's the former president's own personal legal battles, which could fade if he's reelected or come roaring back if he loses. Back to you.
All right, Laura Jarrett, thank you so much. And now let's bring in Ned Foley for more. He is the director of election law at Ohio State. Ned, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be here.
Busy day, big day. We appreciate your time. I want to start with the fact that in all, nearly 200 election-related lawsuits have been filed across the U.S. before today, many of them in battleground states. For people who are like, huh, why, how, we haven't even started this whole thing yet, what are those about? How can that impact today?
Most of those are irrelevant at this point because they lack merit. They were skirmishing in an effort to try to affect what the rules for today would be. But most of them were dismissed by courts and at this point are just in the rearview mirror. There are few that are lingering, as we just heard, that could come back to life depending upon the outcome, and those are the ones to focus on at this point.
What are you concerned about, and at what point, either in tonight or maybe in the days and weeks ahead, if we were to see a big concern, something that does end up kind of drawing out the way that 2020 did, when do you think that would come? And is there anywhere that you're particularly keeping your eye on that it may come from?
Well, Pennsylvania, not just because it's crucial, but because the laws in the state lend themselves to a little bit more litigation than some of the other battleground states. That doesn't mean that there's going to be problems or that the litigation will end up mattering, but if it ends up being as close as it could be, you can't expect lawsuits in Pennsylvania to fight over some ballots. And there's really two categories of ballots that lawyers look at after the polls close. One are those mailed ballots that haven't been counted yet because they're just sitting there as a pile that could go either way. So they'll be a focus of attention. And the other category is called provisional ballots, which voters cast on election day if there's any question about their eligibility. And the name provisional means provisional, and so they have to be looked at to see whether they're eligible. So those are the two groups of ballots to keep an eye on.
And when you say Pennsylvania's laws lend itself to like maybe something like this happening, confusion, stress after the fact, which laws are we talking about? We heard a little bit about this in Laura's piece, but walk us through it.
Sure. The one thing that's particularly true about Pennsylvania is it's very decentralized, meaning the local boards of elections have control on how to administer the process. So it's not statewide uniformity. And that means that if one locality does something a little bit different from another, that can get lawyers' attention because of the concept of equal protection and equal treatment of all voters. Again, not to say that, I don't want to be alarmist, it's not to say that these lawsuits are going to really determine anything, but this county by county variation is at least something for lawyers to look at.
Quickly, before I let you go, for somebody who's at home and watching and is concerned that the election might not be safe or secure, what would you say to them?
No, be confident that the legal system is in good shape. As we just heard, Congress passed a new law that's designed to make sure that the rule of law prevails, meaning that ballots get counted as they should be according to the law, and that politicians can't mess with the results just because they don't like the results.
Ned, thank you very much. Appreciate your time and expertise this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Stay with us. Of course, our continuing coverage of Decision Day in America continues all throughout the morning.